Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We are an open dialogue on culture and ideas with a particular focus on education, and we are actually trying to repair the silence on education in today's media. And with that being said, I'm so excited to introduce a wonderful couple. I call them the first couple of systems thinking, David Stroh and his wife Marilyn Paul. And I got to know what this whole systems thinking is. I had no idea what it was, true confession, until I took a course, my first course in a doctoral program at Drexel University. And Mr. David Stroh is on the curriculum with this book, okay? And yeah, and it's fascinating. I want our audience to sort of get a basic understanding of what systems thinking is, you know, sort of systems thinking for dummies a little bit. And I'm the biggest dummy because, you know, I'm still trying to figure out what it is. And but I know it has certain things. And I'll be honest, I'm reading this book, Systems Thinking for Social Change, and I'm thinking, first of all, we need a lot of social change right now. I mean, we're living in a world in which I think the scientists say we have 10 years left to save the planet, right? I recently picked up Greta Thunberg's, you know, book of essays about, you know, we have 10 years left. We have to change the system, you know, and racism and economic inequality. So, you know, anything to help is wonderful. And as I'm reading this book of David's, I'm thinking like every sentence is like a masterpiece of wisdom. I'm like underlining and notes in the margins, and I'm thinking more people need to read this. This has got to be sort of, you know, for every citizen to know what this is. And even thinking, you know, that there ought to be maybe a cabinet level position on this, you know. And but, you know, Marilyn knows just as much as David, and we're going to get to Marilyn, but actually, let's do a ladies first now, because one of the systems we're trying to repair in our world is the system of, you know, that we're leaving the women out, okay? So as we move beyond patriarchy, we're going to let Marilyn go first and talk a little bit about her work in systems thinking. Two books that she has written that has been of great interest to me with wonderful titles. Marilyn, you're the queen of titles, okay? And one of them is, How Do You Make a Difference If You Can't Find Your Car Keys? And I said, you just told my life story there. So why don't we begin with that? And how do we make a difference, and how do we overcome disorganization in our own lives to make a difference in the world?
So I wrote this book.
Yes.
Because I struggled with chronic disorganization. And I called the book, It's Hard to Make a Difference When You Can't Find Your Keys, because when you're looking for your keys, you really can't do anything else. You can't leave the house, you can't drive your car.
Yeah.
And your keys are also emblematic of what's important to you. So we can't make a difference when we're spending our energy and mental focus on just trying to locate our keys, our papers, our tickets, whatever they are. If we can't find them, we are not at our best. So so it's hard to make a difference when we're not at our best.
Wow. You are a lucky man, David, to have such a wise woman in your life. And so, David, why don't you, you know, in terms of your own work, give our audience a quick introduction in terms of systems thinking and in terms of social change. And as we're coming out of COVID, too, let's all keep this in mind now. You know, when you think about disorganization in the homes of, you know, people, you know, this past year has been so awful, and finally we see a glimmer of hope, and the vaccine is kicking in. How can systems thinking, you know, how does it come? There's a lot of social life in systems thinking, right? A lot of conversations, and we've been isolated from each other. So how does the systems thinking approach now, how does it kick in as we move beyond COVID?
Well, I think we're all longing to get back to connection. And systems thinking is ultimately about appreciating connectedness. We so often are encouraged just to do the best we can with our little part of the world, and we forget often some of the impacts that we have on others. We react to things that others do, and the interdependencies between us tend to get unappreciated and not taken into account. So whether it's political polarization at the moment, we live in two different political worlds pretty much, whether it be our disconnect as human society from nature, as we're seeing with climate change, those are connections that need to be appreciated and cultivated literally in order for us to survive.
Wow, wow. And maybe you could get into a little bit about how your work interacts, because now we have a system of a marriage, right? We have two systems thinkers in a marriage. And how did you guys meet?
We met through friends.
Okay.
I had just turned 40, and I realized I wasn't married and I better do something about it. So I asked everyone I knew to introduce me. And so through friends, two friends of ours, mutual friends, introduced us.
We also knew a lot of professional colleagues in common because we are, in broadly speaking, the same profession of organizational change and organization development. So Marilyn, in a sense, came to systems thinking, I guess, in parallel with what I was doing at the time, and we recognize that as a family, we're a system. What I do, I mean, it sounds so naive in a certain way and simplistic, but what I do impacts her, what she does impacts me, and that's either going to be for the better or it's going to be for the worse. We can build each other up or we can tear each other down. And that's true in life and systems as well. We can create connections or facilitate connections that are mutually supportive, or we can create connections that are destructive. But it's usually one or the other, ultimately, because that connection might be ignored, but it can't be wished away.
Wow, wow. So, one of my takeaways from this course on education, leadership, and change, I'll put a plug in for my professor, Dr. Jeffrey Rhodes, just finished the class, and hopefully I'll get a little extra credit for having Dr. Stroh and his wife on. But anyway, this idea that we are the system, right? That the leader of an operation, whether it's a school, whether it's a nonprofit, my wife and I co-produce our TV show, that our own psyches, our own who we are as people affects the organization. So that if we're growing and changing, that's going to also affect the organization. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, I'm fascinated by that. Maybe Marilyn, you could chime in if that's something. How do we become how do we affect the organization that we're changing?
Well, one thing I'll just say in a way, back up for a second, but I got my PhD in organizational behavior. And one of the things I think our field struggles with is this whole idea of separate units. Like if you look at an organization, people say the units are separate. There's a hierarchy. They're connected by different leaders in an organization. And we're not taught to think in a school of management. I got a PhD in a school of management. We're not taught to think systemically. We're not taught to look for leverage. As David said before, we're taught to optimize our own subsystem. And as leaders, I think we're really taught to have goals go after our goals, maybe create a team to work on our goals, but rarely are we asking, how does my going after my goal affect colleagues in different part of the organization? And one thing I noticed before I came to systems thinking, I was doing a lot of change consulting in organizations, specifically about inclusion and increasing diversity. And we would make long lists of things that were not going well. People of color weren't advancing. There were no women in top management. These were very serious issues. And we'd make lists of the problems, and then we would make lists of the solutions. And it was not until I joined Innovation Associates that I learned, wait a second, what does my list of solutions have to do with each other? And since time and energy and focus are limited, what are the fewest changes we can make that will yield the biggest impact on the organization? And that's why I loved systems thinking. And I hadn't learned about it in my graduate program. And it revealed a whole world of how things change to me.
Well, I want to take that concept and pass the ball over to David now and talk in terms of social change. And what would be the simplest, smallest thing that we could do as a planet or as a society to reap, to sort of what you call leveraging up in terms of that would make a change to help save the world? I mean, we're trying to save the world here too, right? I mean, what are the smallest things that we could all do in our everyday lives to maximize that change?
Wow. Smallest thing we could do.
Yeah.
Can I jump in on that just for a second? Then
it's a dialogue. This is a dialogue.
So
yeah.
I think one of the changes we all need to make is to take a bit of separation from our point of view, to understand the human brain, the human mind has a very peculiar setup. And the setup of our mind is to take our perspective and think it's the truth. So I think the most important thing any of us can do with that little bit of separation, this is my point of view, but it is a point of view, and take our point of view and get curious about your point of view. And we get curious, and then let's say you and I have very different points of view about what's important in this country. If we're both we're rattling each other because we have different points of view. If we have the skill of stepping back a little bit and getting curious and maybe settling down, why are you thinking that? I'd like to know. And your view could actually change my view.
Wow. I mean, that is what every American needs right now, because we're so at each other's throats, right? It's there's such a knee jerk. Somebody says this, all of a sudden, the left and the right, and then we've got to calm down. We've got to have some kind of collaboration. And but this reminds me, David, a little bit of this concept in leadership or systems thinking of getting on the balcony, which is kind of the cool thing. Like, instead of being on the dance floor, and sometimes you want to be on the dance floor because things are happening and it's groovy, and you guys are in California, you know what the dance floor is like, and right. But then once in a while, then you get up on the balcony, and now it's like for sort of a critical view of a critical distance that you could see, reflect more on what's going on.
Absolutely. There's a metaphor that we use a lot in systems thinking of the blind man and the elephant. So this is an old Sufi story. It's about over 1,000 years old. And the idea is that different blind people are touching different parts of an elephant, and based on the part that they're touching, they assume that that's reality. So the one who's touching the ears might say, well, this is a fan. And someone touching the leg is saying this is a tree trunk. And the one who's touching the hair might say it's a brush. All of them see or are in touch with part of this larger reality. But as Marilyn said, they all swear that the part that they're in touch with is reality as opposed to part of it.
Is the
And
whole
that
elephant.
the whole elephant.
Yeah.
So we ultimately need each other to get a better sense of what reality really is. And to learn from each other and to recognize that we see part of the elephant, but we don't see it all. Other people see different parts. The other thing I would say in terms of what we can do is to recognize that we're all part of the problem, not just part of the solution. Yeah. There's a tendency to feel that we know what needs to be done. We have the solutions, we're working on the solutions, we're part of the solutions in some way. And it's very hard for us to step back and appreciate that we might, however unwittingly, and it usually is unintentional, that somehow we're creating or contributing to the very problem that we're trying to solve. And we don't arrive at that awareness in order to point the finger back at ourselves, but ultimately to empower ourselves. Because the greatest control that each of us has over the system, whatever it is, begins with recognizing our own intentions, our own thinking, and our own behavior. So that stance, rather than blaming others or blaming ourselves for what isn't working, is actually an empowering stance to take, because if we can see how our intentions, thinking, and behavior are contributing to the problem, we're actually have one leg up on contributing to the solution. We're no longer just trying to change other people, we're starting with ourselves. And that also is a very important quality in marriage, to recognize when there's a conflict between us, how is each of us, albeit unintentionally, contributing to the problem.
Wow. And you know, all of that sounds wonderful and everything, but just to sort of play devil's advocate and to come in with a critique,
Great.
What do you say to folks who, like, for example, who would say, well, gee, you know, back in the 19th century when the union movement started, right? Oh, okay, we have a system there of somebody calling. All right, okay. Unintended consequence of a phone call. That's another word from systems thinking, unintended consequence. Maybe we'll get to that later. But this, like, for example, in the 19th century when you had a union movement, those guys with the union, they fought battles. You know, they went in there. They didn't sit back and say, gee, how am I contributing to the problem, you know? So is there a danger of relativizing the kind of real tough political realities, like the erosion of democracy, the rise of fascism? You know, if you look at the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, nobody, you know, you know, you can't just kumbaya that away. You know, we're all just going to sit together and be, you know, wonderful and collaborate, whatever. Some people don't want to collaborate, you know. And so how do you reconcile systems thinking with a critique that might call it like maybe a little depoliticized or relativistic?
I think it's a great question. I tend to believe and lean toward starting from the point that there are ways that we could collaborate if we discovered our commonalities, if we recognized shared values that we might have. Even, let's say, around something like abortion, often people on the right and the left will agree that teen pregnancy is not a good thing. They may have different reasons for it, but ultimately, they can agree on something and start from that. In South Africa, at the end of apartheid, what people were able to do, they wouldn't be able to say, what is the society necessarily that we want to create? But they could look at different scenarios, different ways in which the future could unfold, and collectively agree, this future would be better than that future. And they could collectively mobilize themselves toward a future that ultimately seemed to serve them better than one that didn't. Recognizing how we are part of the same current reality and how we're interdependent, that's another type of commonality to discover. So if we can do that, fantastic. I think it just makes for a more sustainable solution. If we can't get there, then certainly social activism, policy change, advocacy, fighting it out in voting, and so on and so forth, those definitely can be called upon and need to be called upon. Saul Alinsky, who is a famous community organizer, talked about the low road to morality. You know, I like to operate from the high road to morality first and see where it can get us. And if necessary, we got to go the low road. And that, I think, is the type of, win-lose circumstances that you're talking about. Often people assume win-lose, however, when that isn't necessarily the case. And that's where the opportunity for collaboration can come in.
So I have a very different point of view on this.
Go ahead, Marilyn.
I came to systems thinking from a lot of study at the School of Labor Relations at Cornell. And systems thinking, in my view, is not great for power differentials. It's good for certain type of problems. It's good for solving certain types of complex problems when you can convene a group of players who might not have spoken, but who really recognize they're interdependent. For certain types of power distortions, I'm not sure that systems thinking helps us very much, but it's just what I hope for people is that they gain an understanding from where they sit, that pushing harder to get more done, working harder, pouring energy into solving a problem may never solve that problem. And that thinking more systemically, looking for leverage might be a good way to go.
Wow. And taking a day off, according to Marilyn, is also a very good thing. And as the title of your book says, could save your life.
Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot about this lately, about how overworked our society is, and full confession, I ran for president twice. I didn't win. My wife is looking at me. No, but I did it symbolically in 2008 and 2012. And I was calling on a 25-hour work week as part of my candidacy. Because I do think we're an overworked society. We're overrushed. We're frenzied. We need to slow down. I think, Marilyn, you talk about this also in your work. And so the system is clearly broken in some way, and people are coming home. We live in Hoboken, New Jersey, my wife and I, and we see people coming back and forth on the PATH train, pre-pandemic, exhausted at 8 o'clock at night, Sometimes you go on the train in the morning and there's such a quiet, people are just depressed having to trudge off to jobs, that they don't like, that lack meaning. So there's so much we can do to transform society. And I'm sort of getting a feeling now with the two of you that you ought to be more on the bigger media. And part of the reason maybe you're not is because that's one reason the system is not changing, because we're not, they're always showing the polarization, right? As if that's the sexy thing, you're left, you're right, let's have argument, and that makes ratings go up. But in a better media, we would hear more from David and Marilyn. Does that make any sense? Or?
Well, certainly from a political point of view, fear and anger tend to get more votes. And if you can appeal to those more visceral emotions, people stop thinking actually about what will serve them, and they will just react. So ultimately, systems thinking is a creative act, not a reactive one.
And also, when people are tired, it's very hard to think systemically.
Yes.
And we have one of our articles is called, "Is Moving Too Fast Slowing You Down?" Because as people speed up, they do not think as well, they do not engage in highly productive conversations, they make more mistakes. And so one of our articles is about that whole dynamic, where I actually think, from the research I've done, people actually do work, good solid work, for 25 hours a week. And the rest of it is fighting, making mistakes, struggling with their colleagues. But 25 good hours of work could really keep us as productive as we need to be.
Some of the neuroscience shows that literally people's executive functioning goes out the window if they're under too much stress.
Right.
So if you are a leader, if you are an executive, and your job is planning and strategy and facilitating productive relationships among the people who work for you and so on, and you're continuously stressed out, you won't be able to do your job, literally as well as figuratively.
Wow. So, I've heard it say that COVID was kind of like this big pause, right? That it gave us time to reflect. It's like we were all in some ways on the balcony, and do we really want to go back to what we were doing?
Right.
And system as usual, and is that happening now? And what are the leaders? You guys are the leaders in terms of systems thinking. What should we be thinking now in terms of transforming and using this moment in time to really go off in a different way and say we got to save our planet, and what's
well, it's been very striking to me how this whole question of going back to normal, do we go back to normal, do we not go back to normal, and very, very important, I think, for each of us in our families, in our work groups, to study. There's the moment, like the transitional moment, the liminal moment, gives us so much information about how to change. And I just rode down to the Bay because I ride my bike down. And
San Francisco Bay? San Francisco Bay, is that?
Yeah, Bay.
Okay.
And Route 80 is a major artery, and it was packed at 3:30 in our afternoon. The traffic was intense, very slow. And I thought in that moment that before we're all the way back, could we ask ourselves, what was the benefit of the pandemic? Not, thank God we got over it. It's, at least we did, and not everyone is over it. Not everyone has gotten through, not just being grateful, which is wonderful, but what did we learn? What were we able to do differently? What is success for us now? What do we want in our neighborhoods? What do we want in our workplaces? And see if we can use this moment to shift our mindsets about what is a good life, what is good work, what happens when we really focus our care and intention on making our planet livable, because there actually is nothing more important right now. The racial justice comes with economic justice, and environmental justice means we're all, but mostly those in powerful decision-making places, we need to change. Now is the moment. And we do have this transitional structure right now. Today is, as we're recording this, is June 15th. and California is officially opening up today.
Oh,
Yeah, reopening.
historic day.
It's a historic day.
Certainly, how we work is open to negotiation, I think, in a way that hasn't happened before. Because there are, right now at least, a high demand for jobs, people looking for jobs often have more negotiating power. And younger people have more negotiating power. And many of them are saying, look, I don't want to do this commuting stuff. And the technology, we've proven how much we can actually just get done through working at home and through video conferencing. Now, I still believe that there are many types of work and types of interactions that are certainly facilitated by face-to-face interaction, and we shouldn't ignore that, and we should go back to it to some extent, but not all the way back. I mean, CO2 levels around here went down enormously, and elsewhere around the country, around the globe, people saw CO2 levels go down dramatically in the early stages of COVID, when people weren't going out and driving around much at all for anything. So hopefully that is one of the big opportunities.
Wow. David, maybe if you could just give our audience a quick sort of a synopsis of your biography, and in terms of how you developed into a person interested in systems thinking and leadership, in terms of your intellectual, just a quick elevator speech version for me also, and our audience, in terms of colleges you went to, thinkers that were important to you. If you could just give us the quick version of that. Yeah.
Well, I was going to be an urban transportation planner, and actually got degrees in civil engineering and urban studies from the University of Michigan. I was very interested in connecting people more effectively to each other and to their environment, and I loved transportation. I used to keep my eyes glued in the first subway car on every trip I took in New York City, where I grew up, and loved to read road maps and draw road maps and build roads with my building blocks. I just was into the whole thing.
What neighborhood, David, did you grow up? Which neighborhood?
Say what?
Which neighborhood did you grow up in?
Inwood Park, very northern tip of Manhattan.
One of my favorite neighborhoods in New York. I actually taught up there at a place called CUNY in the Heights, and I just fell in love with it. We call it upstate Manhattan. It's
yeah. It's the only primitive forest in Manhattan.
Absolutely.
Inwood Park.
Yes. And the only salt marsh. There's actual salt marsh up there too.
There's a salt marsh. Absolutely. And I could be in the, playing in the park, which has no cars in it, surrounded on water by two sides. And then I could walk down the hill, hop on the A train, and be midtown in half an hour.
Wow, that explains so much in terms of your interest in systems thinking. That little biographical sketch, that was very valuable. And Marilyn, turning to you, a little biographical sketch. What brought you to systems thinking, from your childhood up till now? Anything?
I majored in college in anthropology, and I had the amazing good fortune I was studying in France for the year, and I was in Paris for a year. And my professor from Colombia was going to West Africa, to the Ivory Coast, and I was invited to go with him on a research trip. And I think it was there that I learned how interconnected things are, but also about the destructiveness of the force of colonialism. So I learned a lot in that trip. And then that's where I decided to get an MBA. And once I got an MBA, which was not in my nature so much, but I could see the power of this idea of amassing capital to make a difference. And then I ended up studying organizational behavior at Yale. And interestingly, there was no systems thinking being taught there. It was being taught at MIT. And once I got out of that program, I was exposed to systems thinking and realized that I had a big gap in my education. And that's when I started studying systems thinking and then teaching systems thinking.
Wow. Well, here I'm just pulling it off my bookshelf. This is one of my 15 books, and its title is Spy in the House of Capitalism. Spy in the House of Capitalism.
Wow.
Wow.
Neat.
Very important book.
Thank you. And the concept is corporate America. What do you do? Like, I found myself 10 years ago, I got a real estate license because I was tired of being a broke adjunct professor, you know. So here I was in the corporate provinces of Manhattan, you know, but really I'm a diehard liberal lefty academic scholar type, you know. What the heck am I doing here? I said, I'm here to take the money and run to make a better world. So the concept of Spy in the House of Capitalism.
The school of systems thinking that our work grew out of was by Jay Forrester, who was a computer scientist actually at MIT, and began to recognize how what he understood about information systems and electrical systems in terms of features like feedback and delay and so on were actually very applicable to what managers were trying to do. And he wrote a book called Industrial Dynamics to help managers understand some of the non-obvious ways in which their decisions actually played out over time. So you mentioned this idea of unintended consequences. He then wrote a book called World Dynamics. Several of his students wrote a book called Limits to Growth already in 1972, recognizing the kinds of climate change challenges that we were heading into already at that time. So the field has grown enormously. There is one school of it, the original school of that particular type of systems thinking, which is very quantitative in nature, expert modeling type of work. The type of work that we do is actually more qualitative in nature and tends to be more accessible, more user-friendly. There are also other approaches to systems, like soft systems methodology. So the field has branched and grown in parallel in a variety of different ways. I think it will continue to grow because interdependence in our world is simply becoming more unavoidable. You know, we think we can do it on our own, whether it's us individually or us as a nation or however we would divide that up. But we're beginning to see more and more that our fates are ultimately connected to those of the people around us. And we better figure out how to redesign the boat that is currently sinking in a way that we can all stay afloat. Because it's not going to be feasible, really, for quote unquote some people to survive and other people not in the long term.
And in terms of your system as a couple, as a marriage, in terms of your thoughts, and where does that come in terms of systems thinking, the agreements, the disagreements? I noticed a little bit of creative tension there. Marilyn brought up when she said, "Oh, well, I'm very different in terms of maybe politics." Or do you talk politics? Do you agree or disagree?
For us, I think we're always working to both surface some of our deepest perceptions of the world so that we can support each other to go after our goals. We're very different. We've got very different thinking about things, but I'll tell you something. So I will just share that Bill Gates came out with a book very recently about climate change and essentially how to save the planet. And he made a very important statement that in order to have zero carbon release in 2050, it's very important not to put in temporary measures that reduce carbon release by 2030, which I know that idea is very important, and yet people are scrambling to make progress by 2030. So I mentioned this to David and gave him the book, and the other night we're getting ready to go to sleep, and he's in bed busy diagramming the problem and the dynamic. And so what I find exciting is to keep really helping so we can help each other figure out the dynamics. We've named the number of our positive and negative dynamics, and it's just very alive.
Wow.
And I would also say, and this is not systemic by nature necessarily, but having a shared sense of humor really helps.
Oh, look at Claudia smiling over here. If you saw her, she's smiling. Look at that. Look at she's smiling. She agrees 100%, 100%. Because it is rare, to have a couple like this on TV talking about these things, talking about the subject you're talking about, but also going on a meta level and talking about how you interact with each other. I mean, it's like, how can we learn how to have better relationships in our society when our media is just like showing talking points and this pundit and that pundit and, everybody's yelling and, I don't know. Maybe it's just me.
Well, I want to go back to the book you wrote about A Spy in the House of Capitalism, because I think what we're learning right now is that profit comes from uninternalized externalities. Profit, for the most part, does not really exist. And it's not because I'm a socialist, it's because if we look at our planet, we have stolen profit either from the future or from nature or from people who are underpaid. And this is why it is so important for each of us to pay attention to the impact of our own behavior. And I'll just say one thing about resting a day a week.
Oh, yeah.
One reason why it's so important is so we remember what is important to us. And then my next book right now is called Get Food on the Table Without Making Such a Mess in the Kitchen and on the Planet, because surprisingly to me, and maybe to others, our household food waste, about 21 billion pounds of waste a year, is a large part in methane gas release. And it's something that we can address every day. We can reduce our waste every day. And as we do that, we actually improve our lives because we internalize our own externalities.
Wait a minute, hold it. I got Bernie Sanders on the phone right here. Wait a minute, Bernie. Yeah, you mentioned socialism. Okay, yeah, Bernie, I got David Stroh and I got Marilyn Paul here. Marilyn, the queen of titles. Yeah, you got to put her on, the next campaign to come up with your slogan. I really think, anyway, that's a little comedy. But
we are not socialists, by the way.
No.
Social democrats, I think I would go with that, but not socialists.
You think Uncle Joe Biden is doing a good job so far?
Personally, I think he's doing as well as he can do under the circumstances.
And if he created a department of systems thinking, David, would you'd be in the running? The two of you, as a couple, I would say that put the two of you in there. That you should be at the dinner tables of these conversations. Because again, I want to go back to this book, Systems Thinking for Social Change. And as I'm reading it, honestly, I'm not trying to butter you guys up. I'm underlining things and I'm thinking like every human being needs to know this stuff. You know, like when you talk about catalytic conversations and how they help us evolve and grow and change and move forward, and it's just phenomenal. And shared visioning, right? The idea of shared visioning. Why don't we do more of this in school? I mean, what they're teaching in school today with these standardized tests and curriculums, why don't we move toward what you guys are doing? And you know, I think we would have a much better world.
But I think you're making an excellent point, John. And Jay Forrester actually created a foundation, a nonprofit called the Creative Learning Exchange, still exists. And they create curricula in systems thinking for K through 12 education, beginning in kindergarten. And one of the very important things to recognize about systems thinking is that at some level it is actually child's play. It is
Yes.
natural to think
Yes.
in terms of connection.
Oh.
So the example I like to give is when our son was young, and you can think if you have kids about your own kids, how many years did you end up picking up after your kids beyond when you thought they should really be able to do this by themselves at this point? And what I point out is that our son knew very well that if he didn't pick up after himself, I'd eventually get so frustrated that I would do it for him. So he understood the notion of time delay. Wait long enough.
I see.
And he understood the dynamic called shifting the burden to the intervener.
Okay.
Which is a classic dynamic in systems work, a classic story, a classic pattern or structure. And he knew that if he didn't fill in, I would fill in. I was the quick fix in the system. And even though I teach this stuff, by the way, I could fall into that trap just as readily as anybody else. But he understood it intuitively. And in some ways, I believe, and Forrester and our colleagues generally feel that systems thinking gets educated out of us. And it's a matter of recovering a natural ability that we have rather than creating, trying to throw some abstract foreign set of ideas on top of what we should already be knowing.
Wow. Well, Claudia's taking notes over here, so something good is happening. And I know that, in terms of this dialogue that we're having, sort of evolved in a very natural way because I reached out to David individually first because, from reading your book, and I said, boy, I want to connect with this man, have him on our show. And then I just sort of inadvertently found out that Marilyn is doing this amazing work. And then we had that sort of conversation where, should we do one for David, one for Marilyn? I said, let's just do it all together. Come on, let's all get in the pool here, And it was like, we figured it out, and we're sort of fumbling through it as we go along. And I think it's going pretty well. And how do you guys feel about the conversation?
I'm enjoying it.
Very good.
Thank you.
I kind of wish we were at a restaurant somewhere. This feels like a dinner party. And I
Your dinner with the systems thinking couple.
Oh, but you guys should be like a feature at every major intellectual party in California. And if you're not, I don't know what's going on out there. You guys are really interesting and necessary, and the work I think matters. Really, really a lot. And so as we move towards closure, we got about 10 minutes left of precious time. What are some of your thoughts and insights going forward in terms of your work, in terms of what's next, in terms of dreams to achieve, mountains to climb, personally, professionally? David, you want to go first?
Well, I've been really interested in wealth inequality and the problem of growing wealth inequality in the US and in developing countries generally, as wealth is getting concentrated more and more into fewer and fewer hands, which leads to a reaction around populist movements that threaten to destroy democracies. So to me, the connection between wealth inequality, authoritarian leadership, and also racism, they all work hand in hand. And it's a very dangerous set of dynamics that we are reinforcing, sometimes consciously, other times unconsciously. And I recently published an article in the Foundation Review, which is the only peer-reviewed journal in philanthropy, on this topic.
Wow.
And it's one that I want to continue to work with because I see it in a lot of work with my clients. Poverty and growing poverty is a continual issue that people want to address. Helping people gain more access to the resources that are available in our society is becoming more and more important. So that's a big one for me.
And as you were talking, I couldn't help but thinking about the term intersectionality, which has become such a buzzword now, and in terms of the overlapping, it's very systems thinking, right? In terms of a concept, conceptually, and also, of course, critical race theory tries to connect the dots. Critical race theory, which has become controversial, the right wing hates it. They're trying to abolish it from curriculums, but it seems like very systemy. It seems very interconnected. Marilyn, what's next on the agenda, and in terms of your dreams, goals, and
Well, as I said, one thing I'm working on is my third book, and it's really about this whole very, very important issue of food. And it will include who has access to what food, how we eat, and how our relationship to the planet. So many people are under the impression that, for example, the Impossible Burger is a positive next step, which it's a highly processed food, and it uses up an enormous amount of energy and water to produce it. And in the end, the planetary impact is the same as many types of hamburgers. People aren't aware of regenerative agriculture, which is key to actually restoring the health of many farms and ranches and environments. And and what we actually eat transforms our brains and bodies and our children. And so there's a lot of work to do just in the world of food.
Wow.
Marilyn has a real gift for taking very basic resources in our lives, which we can readily get overwhelmed by or misuse. Stuff being one of them, hence the book on keys, or time, and our overwhelming ourselves, which is what the second book is about. And food is obviously another core resource that we're not managing very well. Actually, Paul Hawken, in his book, who's the well-known environmentalist, in his book Drawdown, he identifies sort of the top 100 most serious contributors to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. 11
wow.
of the top 11 contributors to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, 5 of the top 11 are food related.
Oh my goodness.
How
wow.
we grow food, distribute food,
waste food,
waste food, and so on.
and what we eat, a plant-based diet, but also not throwing out those plants, but composting them or eating them. There's so much there.
Claudia and I switched to oat milk this week. Oat milk, okay, and we're surviving it. It's fine, you know. But speaking of Claudia, I always like to say something about love, because love is a system. And my darling wife, Claudia, say hello, Claudia. Come on in here. She's from a little town outside Bogota, Colombia.
Mucho gusto.
Mucho gusto. Mucho more. Mi Claudia. Claudia is a research scientist. She has a master's degree in biochemistry. She does this important work in terms of finding cures for diseases. But together we co-produce this show. I'm coming from the arts and education side. She's coming from science. We somehow meet in the middle and we talk about everything, and nothing gets put on the air until we talk about it. So we're learning and growing along with our guests. And you're creating a wonderful model for being in the world as a couple, as an evolved couple.
Especially for me, because since
Yes.
I'm not from this country, I'm learning a lot of things from all our guests. Like what Madeline was saying about the waste, and in the lab, I see how much waste we produce just in a single lab. My supervisor is like very into environmental things. So we're trying to recycle things, recycle plastic, recycle everything. But it's true. We, as a humans, we generate too much waste that is not good for the planet.
And I will just say one quote from Paulo Freire, who was the great philosopher from Brazil, who is now on the curriculum of Drexel University, where I'm getting my doctorate in education leadership. Now put Paulo Freire on the curriculum because they want to sort of really move forward with the social justice piece. And Freire said that we need to teach for a world in which it's easier to love. Teach for a world in which it's easier to love. And I learned that quote not from reading Freire, but from reading Margaret Wheatley. And Margaret Wheatley uses that quote in one of her books. So this is such a fascinating mixture and of ideas in this rich field of systems thinking and leadership that I'm just being exposed to. And you, both of you, I'm like a kid in a candy store having you on the show right after the class with David Stroh, one of the leading gurus of leadership studies and systems thinking in the world, along with his wife, his darling wife, Marilyn Paul. And the two of them, I call them the first couple of systems thinking. And I think maybe a podcast. What do you think, guys? And get out there and barnstorm the country.
From our very own home.
Why not? In sunny California. Beautiful California. Claudia, how much time would we have? We're out of time, my darling wife says.
Thank you so much, John.
Anyway,
Yeah, thank you both.
both so much. Hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation.
Yes.
And look
We
forward
would
to
love that.
continuing that. So would we. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. It's
Have
been
a
a
wonderful-
pleasure.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it thoroughly as well. Thank you both. Okay.
Bye-bye.
See you.